Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about ancient libraries, not the dramatic version, not the burning of them or the loss of them, or the great debates that happened in them. We are going to talk about the ordinary version, the daily version, the version that happened quietly again and again year after year in rooms full of scrolls and tablets and careful people doing careful work. We are going to take our time. Let us begin before the scholar even arrives at the library. Let us begin in the morning, when the day is still early and the light is still low. A scholar in the ancient world who worked in a library had a morning routine, as people who work in the same place every day tend to develop. They woke at roughly the same time. They ate something modest. The morning meal in most ancient cultures was not the large meal of the day. It was the small one, the one that simply started things. Bread, perhaps, something warm to drink. Whatever was available and familiar. Then they made their way to the library. The route to the library was the same route every day, or nearly so. The scholar knew the way without thinking about it. They knew which streets were narrower, which corners had shade in the morning, which part of the road was uneven underfoot and required attention. They walked with the slightly inward quality of someone whose mind is already ahead of their body, already in the library, already thinking about the work of the day. The library itself, in most ancient cultures where libraries existed as dedicated buildings, was a quiet place. This was partly by design. Libraries were places of concentrated work, and concentration requires quiet, and partly simply a function of what libraries contained, which was books, or scrolls, or clay tablets, depending on the period and the place, none of which made any noise on their own. The scholar arrived. They entered. Let us spend some time on the entering, because entering is a transition, and transitions are worth noticing. Coming into a library from the street was a change. The noise of the street diminished. The air inside was different, cooler, in most ancient library buildings, which were made of thick stone or brick that resisted the heat of the day. The smell changed too. Libraries had a particular smell, shaped by the materials they contained. Papyrus scrolls had a dry, slightly grassy smell. Clay tablets smelled of the earth they came from, a mineral, slightly chalky smell. Parchment, animal skin prepared for writing, had its own smell, animal in origin, processed and dried into something more neutral but still distinctive. The scholar entering the library breathed in this smell without noticing it, because it was simply the smell of the library, as familiar as the smell of their own home. They had smelled it thousands of times. It was the smell of their work. They found their place. In most ancient libraries, scholars had customary places where they worked, not necessarily assigned formally, but settled by habit and custom over time. This corner, this table, this particular spot where the light came in well and the drafts were minimal. The scholar sat down. They arranged what they needed. Let us think about what a scholar arranged before beginning work. First, the writing materials. In a library working with papyrus scrolls, this meant a smooth writing surface, a board, a piece of flat stone, on which the scroll could be laid out and read. It meant ink, in a dried form that needed to be mixed with water, stored in a small ceramic pot with a stopper. It meant a selection of reed pens, cut to different widths for different purposes, the nibs prepared by the scholar themselves with a small knife. It meant a small vessel of water for mixing the ink to the right consistency. It meant a pumice stone or a fine scraping tool for correcting errors on papyrus, because ink on papyrus could be scraped away if it had not been absorbed too deeply, though this left the surface somewhat rougher and more absorptive than before. In a library working with clay tablets, as in ancient Mesopotamia, the writing materials were different. Clay, soft and prepared to the right consistency, shaped into flat tablets of a standard size, smooth on the working surface. A stylus made of reed or bone or wood, with a wedge-shaped tip that pressed the characteristic wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script into the wet clay. A small vessel of water to keep the clay workable. A place where completed tablets could be set to dry or fired in a kiln to make them permanent. The scholar arranged these things with practiced efficiency. Each item went in a specific place. The place where it was always put. The place where it would be easy to find when needed without looking. This arrangement was not a conscious decision. It had stopped being a conscious decision long ago and had become simply the way things were arranged. The hands did it while the mind was elsewhere, and then the work began. Let us describe what the work actually was, because the work of scholars in ancient libraries is perhaps less dramatic than we might imagine. Much of the work was copying. In a world without printing presses, the only way to make a new copy of a text was to copy it by hand, letter by letter, word by word, line by line. This was how libraries grew their collections. A scholar or a trained scribe would sit with an original text on one side and a fresh writing surface on the other, and they would read a portion of the original and then write it on the fresh surface, and then read the next portion and write that, and so on through the entire text. This was slow, it was careful, it was repetitive in the way that all transcription is repetitive. You're not creating anything new, you're reproducing something that already exists with as much accuracy as you can manage. The quality of a copy depended on the skill and attention of the copyist. A careful copyist produced a copy nearly identical to the original. A careless or tired copyist introduced errors that might propagate into all future copies made from that copy. The best copyists were those who combined speed with accuracy, who could read, hold in mind, and write a phrase or a sentence without losing letters or making substitutions. This skill was developed over years of practice. It was not glamorous work. It was in fact almost exactly as boring as it sounds. You read a few words, you wrote a few words, you read the next few words, you wrote them, you checked what you had written against the original, you found an error, you corrected it, you continued. Hour after hour, day after day. This was how the texts of the ancient world were preserved and transmitted. Let us now think about the specific physical act of writing on papyrus, which was the primary writing surface in much of the ancient Mediterranean world. Papyrus was made from the papyrus plant which grew abundantly in the Nile Delta in Egypt. The stems of the plant were cut into thin strips. The strips were laid side by side in two perpendicular layers. The layers were pressed together and allowed to dry, and the result was a flat, off-white, slightly fibrous writing surface that was durable and relatively smooth. It could be rolled into scrolls for storage, which was the standard form in which papyrus texts were kept. Writing on papyrus with a reed pen and ink required a particular combination of pressure and speed. Too much pressure, and the pen caught on the fibres of the papyrus, snagging and blotching. Too little pressure and the ink did not transfer properly. The right combination produced clean, even strokes, the letters formed with the efficiency of long practice. A skilled scribe writing on papyrus had a particular posture, slightly leaning forward, the writing arm moving in small controlled movements across the surface, the free hand holding the scroll to keep the writing area flat and stable. The reed pen was held between the fingers and thumb in a way that had been learned in childhood or early training and had not changed since. The angle of the pen to the surface was habitual, automatic. The scratch of the pen on the papyrus was the primary sound of the library. Not a loud sound, a small, dry, continuous sound that filled the quiet space with the evidence of work being done. This sound, the scratching of pens on writing surfaces, is perhaps the most characteristic sound of ancient scholarship, the sound that, more than any other, defined what a library sounded like from the inside. Other sounds were occasional, the rustle of a scroll being unrolled or rolled, the soft knock of a stylus being set down on a clay surface, the clearing of a throat, the sound of someone getting up from their place and walking to the storage area to retrieve another scroll. But mostly it was quiet. Let us now think about the storage of scrolls, because the physical arrangement of a library's collection was a significant practical matter. Scrolls were stored in various ways depending on the library and the period. The most common method was to stand them upright in wooden boxes or cylindrical containers. The Latin word capsa for this kind of scroll box gives us some sense of the standard packaging. The scrolls were rolled tightly around a central rod, called an umbilicus, and the ends of the rod sometimes extended slightly beyond the edges of the scroll for protection. A small tag, a titulus or index, was attached to the end of the scroll, hanging out from the box, bearing the title of the work and sometimes the author's name. The titulus was how you found what you were looking for. You walked along the row of scroll boxes, reading the labels, until you found the one you needed. Or you remembered where things were, because you had been working in this library long enough to know the collection, the way you know the contents of bookshelves you have looked at many times. The organization of a large scroll collection was a significant intellectual undertaking. How do you organize thousands of scrolls so that any given text can be found? By subject, by author, by acquisition order. Different ancient libraries developed different systems. The Great Library of Alexandria, largest and most famous of the ancient world's libraries, had a catalogue, the Pinaeus, compiled by the scholar Callimachus in the 3rd century BCE, that organized its collection by subject and author in a way that was intended to make the contents findable. The Pinaeus itself was a significant work of scholarship. Callimachus apparently surveyed the entire collection, identified the texts, their authors, their lengths, and their subjects, and organized this information into a systematic catalogue. The catalogue did not survive, which is a particular kind of irony. The tool made for finding things is itself now lost, but references to it in later writers give us some sense of what it contained. This is the kind of work that happened in ancient libraries. Not only the reading and copying of texts, but the organizing of them, the cataloguing, the making of finding aids, the work of knowing what was there so that it could be found and used. This is not dramatic work. It is methodical work, the work of going through a collection systematically, making notes, arranging things in order. The person doing it would not have felt that they were doing anything remarkable. They were simply doing their job. They sat with their notes and their scrolls and their catalogue tablets, and they worked through the collection, one scroll at a time, recording what they found. Let us visit a specific ancient library now. The Library of Alexandria, in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, was founded in the early 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was the largest library in the ancient world, eventually containing, according to ancient sources, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, though the exact number is uncertain and the ancient sources disagree with each other. It was attached to the Mausion, an institution of scholarship that supported scholars in residence, providing them with housing, food, and access to the collection in exchange for their scholarly work. Being a scholar in residence at the Library of Alexandria was, by ancient standards, a remarkably comfortable situation. You did not have to worry about where your next meal was coming from. You had access to more text than you could read in a lifetime. You were surrounded by other scholars engaged in similar work, which provided both intellectual companionship and access to knowledge and perspectives beyond your own specialty. What did you do as a scholar in residence at Alexandria? You woke in the morning in your quarters on the grounds of the Mausion, you ate breakfast, you made your way to the library. You found your usual place. You retrieved the scrolls you were working with. You sat down and you worked. The work varied by scholar and by the project they were engaged in. Some scholars were primarily engaged in collecting and editing texts, going through the scrolls in the collection, comparing different copies of the same work, identifying variants between copies, making editorial judgments about which readings were most likely to be original. This is called textual criticism, and it was one of the primary scholarly activities at Alexandria. Textual criticism sounds technical, and it is, but at its most basic it is simply the process of asking, what did this text originally say? If you have 10 copies of a poem and they differ in a particular line, if 7 say one thing and 3 say another, or if all 10 differ slightly from each other, which version is the one the author intended? How do you decide? The Alexandrian scholars developed systematic approaches to this question. They compared manuscripts. They noted variants. They made arguments for why one reading was more likely to be original than another. They marked uncertain passages. They sometimes amended texts, proposed corrections to passages that seemed clearly corrupt or mistaken. A scholar working on a textual problem in the library at Alexandria would spend days or weeks or months on a single passage. They would look at every copy of the text that was available. They would read the passage in its context many times. They would consider the parallels in other texts by the same author. They would make a judgment, record it in their commentary or edition, and move on to the next problem. This work was careful. It was painstaking. It was, to the person doing it, absorbing. The kind of work that pulls the attention fully into itself and makes hours pass quickly. And it was also, by any outside standard, extremely quiet and extremely slow and not at all dramatic. The scholar sat with their scrolls. They read. They compared. They wrote a note. They read again. They looked at another scroll. They wrote another note. They sat for a moment thinking, and then they wrote another note. They unrolled another scroll and found the relevant passage. This is what scholarship looked like from the outside. From the inside, it felt like something different. It felt like the following of a thread, a puzzle being worked, a problem being approached from multiple angles until an answer emerged that felt right. but the outer appearance was the same: a person sitting at a table in a quiet room, reading and writing and occasionally thinking with their pen at rest. Let us now think about the scholars themselves, who they were, where they came from, how they came to be in the library. In the ancient world, access to literacy and scholarship was unevenly distributed. In most ancient cultures, the majority of people could not read. Writing and reading were specialized skills associated with particular professions: scribes, priests, administrators, merchants in some contexts, and were not part of the general education of the population. A farmer in ancient Egypt did not need to read to do their work. A weaver in ancient Greece might live their entire life without reading or writing. These skills were not relevant to most people's daily lives. Those who did have access to literacy acquired it in various ways. In some cultures, literacy was transmitted within families. Scribal families in Mesopotamia, for example, where the knowledge of cuneiform writing was passed from father to son over generations. In other cultures, literacy was acquired through education. The Greek system of education that included reading and writing as fundamental skills for citizens of a certain social level. In others, it was acquired through religious training. Priests who needed to read sacred texts for their professional duties. The scholars who worked in ancient libraries tended to come from the educated classes of their societies. They had the literacy that was the prerequisite for scholarly work. They had in many cases the financial resources or the patronage connections to support a life of scholarship. And they had the particular disposition that scholarship requires: the willingness to sit with a problem for a long time, to read difficult texts, to make careful arguments from imperfect evidence. This disposition is not especially common in any population, and it was no more common in ancient populations than in modern ones. The people who ended up in ancient libraries were a particular type of person, not necessarily a likable type or a socially skillful type, but a type with specific gifts that happened to be useful for the preservation and advancement of knowledge. What were those gifts? Patience, primarily. The ability to do careful, repetitive work without being driven mad by it. A tolerance for ambiguity, for the fact that many scholarly questions do not have clear answers and may never have them. An appetite for texts, a genuine pleasure in reading, in following an argument, in encountering ideas and turning them over in the mind. And a kind of conscientiousness, a care about getting things right that made the scholar unwilling to simply guess or approximate when the truth was knowable. These are not flashy qualities. They do not make for exciting stories. They are quiet qualities, suited to quiet work, and they produce the quiet, slow, enormous work of preserving and transmitting ancient knowledge. Let us now sit for a moment in the library at midday. It is the middle of the day. The morning's work has been going on for several hours. The light in the library has changed as the sun has moved. What was early morning light coming in from one angle is now midday light coming in more directly, brighter, filling more of the space. Some scholars have arranged their work to follow the best light as the day progresses, moving slightly or adjusting the angle of their writing surface. A scholar near the centre of the room has been copying a text for the past 3 hours. They are working from a copy of Aristotle's work on animals, a detailed, methodical text that requires careful attention to ensure that the technical terminology is reproduced accurately, that the numerical data is correct, that the long lists of names of animals and their characteristics are not confused or jumbled. They are perhaps halfway through a long section. They set down their pen. They sit back slightly. They look at what they have written. Their eyes move along the lines they have just produced, checking them against the original. They find a word that they have written slightly incorrectly, a letter transposed, and they reach for the pumice stone and scrape carefully at the error. The surface roughens slightly. They dip the pen in ink and rewrite the word. They look at it again. It is correct. They continue. Another scholar at the far end of the room is not copying, they are reading. Reading a text that they have retrieved from the collection, a geographical text describing the coastline of a distant region. They are reading with a kind of focused attention that is slightly different from copying. They are not reproducing the words but understanding them, building a picture in their mind of what the text describes. Occasionally they pause and look up, not at anything in particular, simply taking a moment to process what they have just read. Then they look back at the scroll and continue. A third scholar is not reading either. They are writing something of their own, composing a commentary on a text, which means reading a passage and then writing an explanation of it, an interpretation, a note about a difficult word or a historical reference, or a point of disagreement with previous interpreters. This is slower than copying because you are generating new text rather than reproducing existing text. A new text requires thought. The scholar writes a few lines, stops, reads what they have written, crosses out a phrase and replaces it with a different phrase, continues, the scratching of pens, the rustle of scrolls, the occasional quiet movement, the light. This is the library at midday. It is not nothing. It is a great deal, actually, when you consider what is happening, the transmission of knowledge, the careful work of preservation, the slow building of commentary and interpretation that is itself a form of knowledge creation. But it does not look like much from the outside. From the outside, it looks like people sitting quietly in a room, reading and writing, which is what it is. This is the quiet life of scholars in ancient libraries. Let us now think about the Library of Alexandria more specifically, because it is the ancient library we know most about, and because thinking about a specific place makes the imagining easier. The Museion at Alexandria, the institution of which the library was a part, was modelled on the philosophical schools of Athens, particularly the Lyceum of Aristotle. The name Museion means a place sacred to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts and learning in Greek religion. It was, in a sense, a research institution, the first of its kind at a significant scale. The scholars at the Museion ate together in a communal dining room. This was a deliberate arrangement. The shared meals were opportunities for conversation, for the exchange of ideas across disciplines, for the kind of informal intellectual contact that enriches scholarship. A geographer dining with a mathematician and a literary scholar might, over the course of many shared meals, find ways in which their work intersected that they would not have found in isolation. The conversation at these meals was, presumably, a mixture of the intellectual and the mundane. Scholarly matters were discussed. So were the ordinary matters of institutional life. Who was getting more space in the collection for their scrolls, what the quality of the food had been lately, who had produced a particularly interesting piece of work. The gossip and the politics of a community of scholars are not fundamentally different from the gossip and politics of any other community of people who live and work together. But we are not here for the gossip. We are here for the quiet. Let us go back to the library itself. The scroll collection at Alexandria was organized in sections. Different subjects were kept in different parts of the building or in different buildings on the grounds. Poetry was separate from philosophy. Medicine was in its own section. Mathematics and astronomy were together. History and geography formed another grouping. Within each section, the scrolls were arranged by author and by work. Finding a specific scroll required knowing the system. A new scholar arriving at Alexandria and wanting to use the library would need to learn the organization, where to look for what. This learning took time, as learning the layout of any large, complex space takes time. But scholars who had been at the library for years knew it as well as they knew their own quarters, and could retrieve a specific scroll from the collection with the efficiency of long practice. The retrieval of scrolls was itself a small daily task with its own routine. You went to the appropriate section. You looked along the row of scroll containers, reading the tituli. You found what you were looking for, or you found that it was already in use by someone else, in which case you waited or found something else to work with in the meantime. You carried the scroll carefully back to your place. Scrolls were not to be dropped, or left lying unrolled, or exposed to moisture, or placed where they might be stepped on. The care of the physical objects was part of the care of the knowledge they contained. At the end of the day's work, scrolls were returned to their proper places. This was not optional, and it was not taken lightly. A scroll left in the wrong place was effectively lost. It might not be found again for years, or might be misfiled permanently, or might be damaged through neglect. The system of the library depended on the discipline of everyone who used it to maintain the organization that made the collection useful. This was, perhaps, one of the more frustrating aspects of working in a shared collection. You relied on other scholars to return things correctly, and not all scholars were equally careful. A scroll that you needed for your work might have been returned to the wrong place by the previous user, or might not have been returned at all, still sitting at someone else's workspace while they were away for the day. The small irritations of shared collections are not unique to modern libraries. They were present in ancient ones too. Let us now leave Alexandria for a while and consider other ancient libraries. Ancient Mesopotamia, the region of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, home to some of the earliest complex civilizations, had a rich tradition of tablet libraries that predates Alexandria by many centuries. The tablets of Mesopotamia were made of clay, inscribed with cuneiform script, and preserved in fired or unfired form. They survive in large numbers precisely because clay is a durable material. Clay tablets buried in the ruins of ancient buildings can endure for thousands of years, while papyrus in most conditions does not. The library of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who ruled in the 7th century BCE, is one of the best preserved examples of an ancient Mesopotamian library. Ashurbanipal was himself an educated man, unusual for a king, who took a personal interest in collecting and preserving texts. Under his direction, scholars were sent throughout the Assyrian Empire to find and copy important texts, and the resulting collection of clay tablets was assembled at his palace at Nineveh. The Nineveh library contained literary texts, most famously the Epic of Gilgamesh, a long narrative poem about a legendary king of which the library held a carefully edited version. It also contained religious texts, omen texts, astronomical records, medical texts, lexical lists, and administrative records. The collection was organized and labeled with colophons, inscriptions at the end of tablets, identifying the content and origin of each text. A colophon might say, such and such a text, copied from an original from such and such a city, by such and such a scribe, in the year of the reign of so and so. This information, the provenance of the copy, was considered important because it allowed the quality and reliability of the copy to be assessed. A copy made from a carefully maintained original from a prestigious temple was more trustworthy than a copy of a copy of a copy. The scribes who worked in the Nineveh library were trained professionals who had spent years learning cuneiform writing, a complex script with hundreds of signs, each with multiple readings requiring extensive memorization and practice. The training of a Mesopotamian scribe began in childhood and continued through adolescence, in schools attached to temples or palaces, where students copied texts repeatedly until the forms of the signs were automatic and the ability to read and write was fluent. The Scriba school texts from Mesopotamia, tablets produced by students learning to write, are among the most abundant of ancient written records, partly because students produced so many of them, and partly because they were fired clay and therefore preserved. They show the practice, the same signs written over and over, the same short texts copied repeatedly, the slow accumulation of skill. This is what it took to become a scribe. Years of sitting and copying, the same movements again and again, until the hand knew the signs without the mind having to tell it. And then, having learned, you spent your professional life sitting and copying in the library or the temple or the palace, producing the documents that kept the institution functioning and the knowledge of the civilization preserved. It was not a life of adventure. It was a life of sitting and writing, in rooms designed for sitting and writing, in the company of other people sitting and writing. This was, for those suited to it, a good life. Let us think for a moment about what the scholars and scribes of ancient libraries thought about while they worked. Copying is a particular mental state. When you are copying text, your attention is divided. Part of it is reading the original, part of it is directing the writing, part of it is checking that what you wrote is what you intended to write. But a portion of the mind, when the hand is working automatically on a familiar task, becomes available for other thoughts. Experienced copyists probably spent significant portions of their copying time thinking about something other than what they were copying, not in a way that introduced errors. The check and balance of reading and writing and checking caught most errors, but in a kind of background mental freedom that accompanied the mechanical work. They might think about a problem in their own scholarly work. They might think about what they planned to eat for the midday meal. They might replay a conversation from earlier in the day. They might think about nothing in particular, their mind drifting in the unfocused way of minds that are occupied with something that does not require their full attention. This mental drifting was part of the texture of library life. It did not interfere with the work. The work continued, the pen moved, but it gave the long hours of copying a slightly dreamy quality, a sense of time passing in a pleasant, unfocused way. Perhaps this is one of the more appealing aspects of the ancient scholar's life, from the perspective of someone trying to fall asleep. The long quiet hours, the familiar task, the mind slightly adrift while the hand does its work. The room full of the quiet evidence of others doing the same, the scratch of pens, the light shifting slowly as the day progresses. Let us now visit a very different ancient library, a monastic library in late antiquity. As the Roman Empire declined in the West and Christianity became the dominant religion of the Mediterranean world, the tradition of classical scholarship was increasingly preserved in Christian monasteries. Monks who could read and write were put to work copying texts, both Christian religious texts and, in many monasteries, the classical texts of Greek and Roman learning. The scriptoria, the rooms set aside for writing in monasteries, were centres of manuscript production and preservation that over centuries preserved much of the classical heritage that would otherwise have been lost. The monks who worked in them were not primarily scholars in the Alexandrian sense. Their purpose was religious, and the texts they copied were often religious texts. But they were careful and disciplined workers who produced manuscripts of high quality, and their work preserved texts that no one else was preserving. The monastic scriptorium was a very particular environment. Monks worked in silence, or at least in enforced quiet, since speaking in the scriptorium was generally not permitted, or was permitted only in low whispers when necessary. This rule of silence was not unique to the scriptorium. It was part of the broader monastic discipline of the rule of St. Benedict and similar monastic rules, which prescribed silence as a virtue and restricted speaking to specific times and contexts. Working in silence for long hours is a particular experience. The absence of speech focuses the attention more fully on the work. The internal life becomes more active. The thoughts that in ordinary social contexts find expression in speech have nowhere to go but inward. The monk copying a text in a silent scriptorium was very alone with their thoughts, even surrounded by other monks doing the same work. The sounds of the scriptorium were the sounds of the work itself. Pens on vellum, the animal skin writing material that replaced papyrus in medieval European manuscripts, the rustle of pages, the quiet sound of an ink pot being set down, the occasional soft scrape of a pumice stone correcting an error. Outside the scriptorium, the sounds of monastic life, the bell marking the canonical hours, the sound of singing from the chapel, distant footsteps. But inside the scriptorium, quiet. The monks sat at their copying desks, slanted wooden surfaces designed to hold the manuscript at a comfortable angle for both reading and writing. The light came from windows, or in darker periods of the year or darker hours of the day, from candles or oil lamps. Working by candlelight was harder on the eyes and produced a smaller circle of adequate light, which meant hunching closer to the work, which was tiring. The physical act of writing on vellum with a quill pen was similar in some ways to writing on papyrus with a reed, but different in others. Vellum, well-prepared animal skin, had a smoother, more uniform surface than papyrus. The quill pen, cut from a large feather, was more flexible than a reed pen, and produced a different quality of line. The ink was different, carbon-based inks, oak gall inks, with different properties than the ancient Mediterranean inks. A monk who had been copying for years knew their quill pens as intimately as any tool they used. They knew how to cut a nib to the angle and width they preferred. They knew how much pressure to apply on the different strokes. the thick downstrokes, the thin cross strokes, the hairline curves. That made up the script they were writing. They knew when a pen was wearing out and needed to be recut, and how to do the recutting quickly and efficiently. The cutting of quill pens was a regular task, done at the beginning of the work session and as needed throughout the day. A small knife, a penknife, which is where our word penknife comes from, was kept at the desk for this purpose. The monk picked up the quill. They held it in the particular way required for cutting. They made several precise cuts with the knife, shaping the nib. They tested it on a scrap of vellum. They made an adjustment. They tested again. When it was right, they began to write. This small ritual, the preparing of the pen, was a kind of transition, a way of beginning the session of work. The monk who had been elsewhere in the monastery, doing other things, became the scriptorium monk through the act of preparing their pen. The cutting of the nib was the marking of the beginning of work. Then they found their place in the text they were copying. If they had been working in this manuscript for several days, they knew where they had stopped. The last line of the previous session was there, the ink dry, the hand of yesterday visible in the letters. They read back a few lines to re-enter the text, to remember where they were in the argument or the narrative, and then they began to write the next line, and then the next, and the next. This is what it was to work in a monastic scriptorium. Not dramatic, not exciting. Simply the daily, careful, necessary work of reproducing text, letter by letter, in the service of preservation and transmission. Many of the books we have today, the classical texts that survived, the early Christian writings, the historical records, survived because monks sat in quiet rooms and copied them, over and over, century after century, one letter at a time. This is the most important, boring work in the history of human culture, and it was done in exactly this way, quietly, slowly, page by page, in rooms full of the scratch of pens and the smell of ink, and the sound of nothing in particular happening. Let us now think about the ancient library as a place of human community, even a quiet community. Scholars who worked together in a library over a long period of time came to know each other, not necessarily in the way of friends. Scholarly personalities are often not particularly socially inclined, but in the way of colleagues who share a space and a purpose and see each other every day. They knew each other's habits. They knew where each person sat, what they were currently working on, what their particular areas of knowledge were. This community knowledge was useful. If you were working on a text and encountered a passage you did not understand, you knew who in the library was likely to be able to help. The person whose specialty was that author, or that period, or that subject. You might approach them during a break, or send a note, or simply wait until an appropriate moment and ask. The asking and answering of questions between scholars was a kind of informal scholarly exchange that complemented the formal exchange of written commentary and debate. An answer given verbally to a question about a difficult passage might be a complete answer that the questioner could use immediately, or it might be the beginning of a longer exchange that eventually found its way into written work. These conversations happened in the margins of the working day, in the brief breaks, during meal times, in the walks between sections of the library. They were not long conversations generally. The work called them back. But they were real exchanges, and they contributed to the scholarly life of the institution. the senior scholars of an ancient library, those who had been there longest, who had the deepest knowledge of the collection and the broadest reputation in their fields, occupied a particular position in the community. They were consulted by younger scholars. They were asked to settle disputes about the attribution or interpretation of texts. They sometimes supervised the work of others, directing copying projects or editorial work. They also simply worked. The senior scholar in an ancient library was not an administrator who had left the work behind. They continued to read and write and think, often for as long as they were physically able. The life of scholarship did not have a clear retirement point. You worked until you could not work, and then you stopped. The older scholars in a library had been sitting in approximately the same place for decades. They had worn something into the floor near their usual seat, or worn smooth the edge of their usual table. Their habits were completely fixed. The specific way they arranged their materials, the specific position they sat in, the specific sequence of tasks that made up their working day. These habits were not noticed by the person who held them. They were simply how you worked. They had been how you worked for so long that the idea of working differently was not a thought that occurred. You sat down, you arranged your things, you began to work. It was like breathing, done without thinking, done in the same way every time. And the library was quiet, and the years passed, and the texts were copied and preserved and organized and studied, and the scholars grew older in their usual seats, and the library was still quiet. Let us now sit with that quiet for a while, because this is ultimately what the ancient library was, a place of organized, sustained quiet in the service of knowledge that was slow to build and fragile to preserve. The quiet of the library was not the quiet of emptiness. It was the quiet of concentration, the quiet of many people doing careful work simultaneously, the quiet of a space that had been designed or had come to be understood as a place where noise was out of place. In this quiet, things happened. The knowledge of the ancient world was preserved. The texts of Homer and Hesiod and Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle and hundreds of others, many now lost, were read and copied and commented on. The astronomical observations of the ancient world were recorded and compared and used to build models of the sky. The medical knowledge of Hippocrates and Galen was transmitted and debated and applied. The geographical knowledge of the ancient world was gathered and organized and mapped. All of this in the quiet, all of this through the patient, repetitive, careful work of people sitting at tables with their pens and their scrolls and their tablets, doing the same things day after day, year after year. There is something reassuring about this. The work of preservation is never finished, and it is never dramatic, and it never announces itself or attracts attention. It simply happens quietly in rooms designed for it by people suited to it. And because it happens, the things worth preserving survive. This has always been so. It is still so. Somewhere, at this moment, someone is doing careful, quiet, preserving work. Not in a library necessarily, and perhaps not with scrolls or tablets, but the impulse is the same. The impulse to take something worth keeping and keep it carefully, in good condition, organized so it can be found, available to whoever might need it. This impulse has been present in human culture since before libraries existed, and it will continue as long as there is something worth keeping. But we are getting philosophical, and philosophy is not what this hour requires. What this hour requires is quiet. And that is what we have. The library is quiet. The scholars are at their work, or resting from their work, or making their way home through the streets of Alexandria or Nineveh or Rome or Antioch or whatever ancient city contains this particular library. The scrolls are in their cases, the tituli hanging out with their written labels, the titles of texts in several languages, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Egyptian, identifying the knowledge stored in each cylinder of papyrus. The clay tablets are in their shelves, dried or fired, the cuneiform pressed into them 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, as legible now as when it was written. The vellum manuscripts are in their bindings, the careful scripts of patient monks preserved under covers of wood or leather, the texts inside unchanged from the day they were copied, all of it quiet, all of it still, and you are also still, and the quiet of all those ancient libraries is here, in this room, in this moment if you let it be. The scratch of the pen has stopped for the night, the scholar has gone home, the lamp is out, the library is dark and quiet, and everything it contains is waiting, as it always waits, for tomorrow's scholars to come back and do their quiet, careful, necessary work. Rest now. Let the library be dark. Let the scrolls rest in their cases. Let the tablets rest on their shelves. The knowledge is safe. The work will wait. And so can you. Good night. For those still listening, a little more. If you're still awake, that is entirely fine. The library is still here. It is always here when you need it. And there is more to say about the quiet life of scholars, if you would like to hear it. Let us talk about the specific experience of reading a scroll. A papyrus scroll was not read the way we read a book. A book opens flat, both pages visible simultaneously, and you move through it by turning pages. A scroll is different. It is a continuous surface, rolled into a cylinder, and to read it you unroll it from one end while simultaneously rolling up the end you have read onto another rod, the right hand feeding out, the left hand taking in, so that a window of text is always visible between the two rolls. This means that reading a scroll requires both hands. You cannot read a scroll and eat at the same time, for instance, unless you have someone to hold the scroll for you or you use a scroll stand, a device designed to hold the scroll open at a particular point so that the reader's hands are free. The experience of reading a scroll also means that you cannot easily flip back and forth through the text the way you can with a book. Looking up an earlier passage meant rolling the scroll back, which took time and care. Finding a specific passage in a scroll without knowing roughly where it was located required unrolling and reading until you found it. This made the scholars' familiarity with the text they worked with more important. If you knew the text well, you knew roughly where in the scroll a given passage appeared, and you could navigate to it efficiently. The length of a scroll was limited by the practical size you could work with. Very long texts were divided across multiple scrolls. Homer's Iliad, for example, was divided into 24 books, which corresponded to 24 scrolls, each book of the Iliad roughly filling one standard length scroll. When you finished one scroll, you set it aside and picked up the next. This physical experience of reading, the handling of the scroll, the two-handed engagement with the text, the inability to look at two different parts of the text simultaneously, shaped how ancient readers read. It was a more embodied experience than modern reading, more physically demanding, more requiring of engagement, and it was, over time, completely normal. The scholar who had been reading scrolls for 20 years did not think about the physical mechanics of it. They simply read, as naturally as we read from a screen or a page, the hand movements automatic, the attention on the text. Let us also think about the margins. Ancient scholarly texts were sometimes annotated in the margins, notes added by readers who had something to say about the passage they were reading. A reader who disagreed with the author's interpretation of a historical event might write a brief objection in the margin. A reader who found a passage particularly significant might mark it with a symbol or a brief note. A reader who encountered an unfamiliar word might write a gloss, an explanation of the word's meaning, above or beside it. These marginal notes are, in a sense, the recorded thoughts of ancient readers. They tell us what people noticed, what they questioned, what they found important. They are a kind of conversation across time, the ancient reader speaking to us through the marks they left in the margin. Looking at an ancient manuscript covered in marginal notes is a particular experience. You see the text of the author, and you see the responses of many different readers over many centuries. Different handwriting, different inks, different styles of annotation, layered one on top of another in the margins and between the lines. Some notes are in Greek, some in Latin, some in other languages. Some are legible and some are not. Some are still being worked out by modern scholars. The scholars who made these notes were not thinking about future readers. They were thinking about the text in front of them, writing what they needed to write to clarify or question or mark something for later reference. But their notes survived, and in surviving they became part of the text's history. This is a very slow kind of conversation. The ancient reader wrote in the margin. Centuries later, another reader read both the text and the ancient reader's note, and perhaps wrote their own note in response. And another century later, another reader did the same. And so the margin gradually filled with layers of accumulated response. It is an extremely quiet conversation, conducted over centuries, in silence, one marginal note at a time, and we are in the silence of it now, in this moment, part of the long conversation of people reading and responding and preserving and continuing, which is another way of saying you are exactly where you should be, quiet, still, in the library of the night, with all the ancient scrolls resting in their places, and all the ancient scholars resting in theirs, and the long, quiet continuity of knowledge passing from mind to mind, across all the centuries, settling gently over everything. Sleep now. The margins are full enough for tonight. There will be more to read tomorrow. Good night. The specific weight of a clay tablet. A clay tablet in the hand has a particular weight, not a heavy weight, a modest, substantial weight, the way a small, smooth stone has weight, more than you might expect from its size, because clay is denser than it looks. The tablets of ancient Mesopotamia came in various standard sizes. The smallest were roughly the size of a large thumb, suitable for short messages or simple lists. Medium tablets were roughly the size of a spread hand, suitable for administrative records and shorter literary texts. The largest tablets were considerably bigger, suitable for long compositions that could not fit on a smaller surface. The scholar or scribe who worked with these tablets every day knew their weight and feel intimate. Picking up a tablet, they knew immediately from its weight and size what kind of text it was likely to contain. They knew how to hold it, flat in the palm to read it, tilted to catch the light at the angle that made the cuneiform impressions most legible. They knew that a wet tablet, freshly made and ready for inscription, had a different feel from a dried tablet. Softer, more yielding, the surface taking the impression of the stylus with a quiet precision that the dried tablet did not. The inscribing of a wet clay tablet was done with an instrument of absolute simplicity. The stylus was a reed, cut to a particular cross-section, held at a specific angle, pressed against the clay to make an impression of its wedge-shaped tip. The wedges were combined in various orientations and combinations to form the hundreds of signs of cuneiform script. The impression of the stylus in the clay was not just visual, it was tactile. You could feel when the impression was correct, the right depth, the right shape, because your hand told you through the pressure of the stylus. Scribes who had been inscribing tablets for years had a finely calibrated sense of the right amount of pressure, the right angle, the right speed of movement. Too slow, and the clay began to dry slightly ahead of the stylus, making the impression rougher. Too fast, and the impressions overlapped or were incompletely formed. The right speed was the practice speed, the speed at which the hand moved when it knew the script well enough not to think about it. And so the cuneiform was pressed into the clay, sign by sign, line by line, across the surface of the tablet. When the inscribed face was full, the tablet might be turned over and the reverse inscribed as well. When the text was complete, the tablet was set aside to dry. If it was an important text that needed to be permanent, it would eventually be fired in a kiln, which hardened it to the durability of pottery. The tablets of Mesopotamia that have survived thousands of years in the earth have survived because they were fired, accidentally in the case of many of them, when the buildings that housed them burned. The fire that destroyed the library destroyed the institution but preserved the tablets, hardening them in the same way a kiln would have, so that they could lie in the earth for 3,000 years and be found and read. This is one of history's quieter ironies. The disaster that ended the library preserved its contents, but we are not thinking about disasters. We are thinking about ordinary days. On ordinary days, the tablets were made and inscribed and dried and stored and retrieved and read and copied in the steady rhythm of an institution that existed to produce and preserve written records. The storage room for the tablets at Nineveh was organized by colophon, the inscription at the end of each tablet that identified its content and provenance. Tablets from the same series were stored together. Tablets from different series were separately arranged. Someone had the job of maintaining this organization, ensuring that tablets returned after use were placed in the correct location. This organizational work was not prestigious. It was not scholarly work in the sense of reading and interpreting. It was housekeeping, important housekeeping without which the collection would descend into chaos, but housekeeping nonetheless. Someone did it, carefully and consistently day after day, and the collection remained findable because of their work. Their name is not remembered. The texts they preserved and organized are still being studied. Let us think about that for a moment, and then let it go. Let us think about what a scholar did when they finished their day's work. In Alexandria, the scholars who lived at the Mouseion returned to their quarters in the late afternoon or early evening, when the light in the library was no longer adequate for close work. They had been working since morning. Their eyes were tired, not painfully tired. but the kind of tired that comes from many hours of focused reading and writing, a slight heaviness, a tendency to blur at the margins of vision. They washed in the simple way available to them. They changed their outer garment if they had one to change into. They went to the communal dining room for the evening meal. The evening meal at the Mausion was the main meal of the day. It was more substantial than breakfast, more social, more leisurely. The scholars ate together and talked about their work, about each other's work, about news from the city, about the quality of the food, about whatever came up in the natural way of conversation among people who knew each other well enough to talk about anything. After dinner, some scholars returned to their rooms and continued working by lamplight for a while, reading something lighter than what they had been working on during the day perhaps, or writing a letter, or simply thinking, reviewing in their mind the questions and problems of the day's work, turning them over in the quieter atmosphere of evening without actively trying to resolve them. Other scholars went to bed soon after dinner. The days were long and the work was tiring in the particular way of concentrated mental work, which is not the tiredness of physical labour, but has its own quality, a quieting of the mind, a readiness for rest that comes from having used the mind fully. Sleep in the ancient world came for most people when the light went and the tiredness was sufficient. There was no entertainment to stay up for, no particular reason to resist the tiredness. The scholar who had been sitting and reading and writing since morning was ready to sleep by nightfall, and they slept. The library was dark. The scrolls were in their cases. The lamps were out. And tomorrow the scholars would come back, and the lamps would be lit, and the scrolls would be retrieved, and the work would continue, as it always had, as it would again tomorrow. Let us now describe the light in an ancient library at different times of day, because light is important, and the quality of light shapes everything that happens in a place. In the morning, when the scholars first arrived, the light was coming in low and directional from the east-facing windows or openings. This light was golden and clear and cast long shadows, making the surfaces of the room look sharp and three-dimensional. It was good light for seeing, though its angle meant that it could be in your eyes if you were facing the wrong direction. By mid-morning, the light had shifted and risen. It was coming in more from above through any skylights or clear-story windows the building had, as well as from side windows. The overall light level was higher, and the room was brighter and more evenly lit. This was the best light of the day for close work, even, bright, not yet carrying the harsh quality of full midday. At midday, the light was at its most direct and intense in Mediterranean climates. The sun was high, and the shadows were short, and the light, where it came in, was bright to the point of harshness. Scholars moved their work away from the direct sunlight, finding the shaded portions of the room where the light was good but not painful. Some buildings had deep eaves or interior courtyards that modulated the midday light before it entered the working spaces. In the afternoon, the light began its shift back toward warmth and angle, now coming from the west rather than the east. The shadows lengthened again, this time in the opposite direction. The light became golden again, and then amber, and then began to fade as the sun lowered. The scholars working in the afternoon light found themselves increasingly dependent on supplementary sources, oil lamps, candles, as the natural light became insufficient for close work. The transition from natural to artificial light was a practical matter in ancient libraries. Artificial light was more expensive than natural light. Oil cost money, candles cost money, and it was also less good for the eyes, being dimmer and more variable. So scholarly work was concentrated in the hours of adequate natural light, and the artificial light of the evening was used more sparingly, for lighter work or for reading that did not require the precision of close textual comparison. The smell of lamp oil in the evening, a particular oily, slightly smoky smell, was as much a part of the library's character as the smell of papyrus in the morning. Different times of day had different smells, and the scholars who worked through the full day experienced both. Now let us talk about errors. Every ancient library copy of a text contains errors. Some errors are minor, a letter transposed, a word slightly misspelled. Some errors are significant, a line omitted, a sentence garbled, a word changed to a different word that changes the meaning. These errors accumulated over centuries of copying, each generation of copies potentially introducing new errors while preserving old ones. The Alexandrian scholars were acutely aware of this problem. It was one of their primary motivations for their editorial work, comparing copies to identify errors and, where possible, recover the original text. They developed a system of critical signs, marks that could be placed in the margin or above the text to indicate different kinds of textual problems. A sign might indicate that a line was suspected of being a later addition. Another sign might indicate that a word was suspected of being corrupt, that the text as it stood did not make sense, and was probably a copying error of some kind. These signs were the tools of the textual critic, the scholar who worked specifically on establishing reliable texts of ancient works. The textual critic was a particular kind of scholar, with particular skills, a deep knowledge of the style and vocabulary of the author whose texts they were editing, a systematic approach to comparing variants, and a willingness to make judgments about which readings were most likely to be original. The making of these judgments was not arbitrary. It was argued. A textual critic who proposed an emendation, a change to the received text, was expected to explain their reasoning. Why did they think this particular word was an error? What evidence supported their proposed correction? These arguments were sometimes written up in scholarly commentaries, which other scholars could read and accept or challenge. The arguments about textual problems in ancient texts were, in some cases, arguments that have been going on for over 2,000 years and have not yet been resolved. Modern scholars still argue about some of the same passages that Alexandrian scholars argued about. The conversation continues, but it continues quietly. In academic journals and monographs that most people never read, scholars argue in careful, precise language about small problems in ancient texts. They cite each other. They disagree politely or less politely. They propose solutions and counter-proposals. And occasionally, after many centuries, a problem that seemed intractable is solved. A new manuscript is found, or a new way of reading the evidence produces a convincing answer that others can accept. These moments of resolution are not celebrated outside the small community of scholars who care about them. They are quiet victories, acknowledged in footnotes, mentioned in conference papers, known to a few dozen people in the world. This is scholarly life. This is what it has always been, and There is something entirely comfortable about it when you let it be comfortable. The quiet persistence of careful attention to small problems, the long, slow conversation across centuries, the patient, methodical, unremarkable work of knowing things carefully. This is the life of the scholar in the ancient library, and it is a good life, and it is the kind of life that produces, in the long run, everything we know about the ancient world, which is how we came to be having this conversation, which is why you know the things you know, which is why the stories and the philosophy and the history are still available to be read and thought about and passed on, because someone sat quietly in a room and copied them, carefully, day after day, year after year in the library. Rest in that, in the knowledge of all those careful, quiet hours, in the patience that preserved everything worth preserving, in the scratch of the pen on papyrus and the press of the stylus into clay and the careful cut of the quill and the silent, steady work of minds that cared about getting things right. All of it quiet, all of it still available, all of it here in some form because someone preserved it. And now it is late, and the library is closing, and the lamps are being put out one by one, and the scholars are making their way home through the streets of the ancient city, and the scrolls are resting in their cases with their labels hanging out, and everything is organized and correct and ready for tomorrow, and you can rest. The library will be here tomorrow. The scrolls will be in their places. The scholars will come back. The work will continue. But tonight, the library is quiet, and so are you. Good night. On the subject of catalogues, there is one more thing worth mentioning before we are entirely finished, and it is the subject of catalogues, the lists of what is in a collection, organised so that things can be found. A catalogue is perhaps the most boring form of human writing. It is a list. It says, this thing is here, in this place, organised in this way. It contains no narrative, no argument, no emotion. It is purely functional, a finding aid, a guide to where things are. And yet, a catalogue of an ancient library is one of the most valuable things an ancient library could have produced, because without a catalogue, the collection is just a large number of scrolls in a large number of containers, and finding anything in it requires either memory or random search. The scholars who made catalogues did not think of themselves as doing important work. They thought of themselves as doing necessary work, which is a different thing. They were organising information so that others could find it, which is a service to others, not a creative act for themselves. But in the long run, the catalogue was an act of intellectual generosity, the gift of accessibility, the making findable of what would otherwise be lost in its own abundance. The Pnyx of Callimachus was this kind of gift. It organised the vast collection of Alexandria so that scholars could find what they needed. Without it, the collection would have been overwhelming. With it, the collection was usable, an instrument for scholarship rather than an obstacle to it. The Pnyx is lost. We know it existed from references in other texts. We know what some of its categories were. We know that it was substantial, a work of many scrolls itself, a catalogue so comprehensive that it was itself a significant achievement of scholarship. But we cannot read it. It did not survive. And so the catalogue that organised the world's greatest ancient library is itself now beyond organisation. It is simply absent, not findable, not retrievable, not there. This is a sad thing, or it is simply a thing. The scholars who made it are also gone. The library they catalogued is gone. The city they lived in is very different from what it was. The world they inhabited is so thoroughly past that we can reconstruct it only in fragments from the text that survived and the archaeology that has been done. But the impulse that made the catalogue, the impulse to organise, to make findable, to serve future scholars by doing the patient work of listing, that impulse is not gone. It is in every database, every library catalogue, every index of every book ever published. It is here, in the organising of this story into sections and passages that move through the subject systematically. It is not so different from a catalogue, and it has brought you here to this moment in the quiet at the end of the day, in the library of your own mind, where everything you have ever learned is kept in some organisation that you do not fully understand, but that mostly lets you find things when you need them. Your mind is a library, and right now the library is closing. The lamps are going out. The scholars have gone home. The catalogues are closed. The scrolls are resting, and you can rest too, in the quiet of the library, in the long, slow, patient quiet of everything that has been carefully preserved and organised and made available for tomorrow. It will all be there tomorrow, including you. Rest now. Good night. The scholar who arrives early. In every ancient library there was one scholar who arrived before the others, not because they were required to, not because the library opened at a specific hour that they needed to be first through the door, but because they were the kind of person who preferred the early morning, the still time before the institution fully woke up, before the other scholars arrived and the quiet deepened from solitude into community. This scholar arrived when the morning was still dim and cool. Perhaps a library attendant had already opened the doors, or perhaps this scholar had a key, which was a sign of seniority and trust. They entered the library before anyone else and stood for a moment in the empty room. The empty library was different from the occupied library. In the occupied library, the quiet was the quiet of people choosing not to speak. In the empty library, the quiet was simply the absence of people, a different, more absolute quiet, the quiet of a room in its own state, without the shaping presence of human activity. The scholar stood in this quiet and breathed it in. They were not thinking anything in particular. They were simply present in the familiar room in the early morning before the day had properly begun. This was the part of the day they particularly valued. This brief window when the library was theirs alone, when they could move through it without consideration for others, when the accumulated quiet of the space was undisturbed. They went to their usual place. They set down what they had brought. They arranged their materials in the familiar way. And then they began to work before the light was fully good, before the institution was fully awake in the quiet of the early morning in the library. This is a recognizable kind of person, the early arriver, the one who's already at their desk when others are still making their way. They exist in every scholarly institution, in every era. They are doing the same thing, claiming the quiet before it fills with other people's presence. The early scholar in the ancient library worked in silence for perhaps an hour before the first other scholar arrived, and then the quiet changed slightly, as it always does when another person enters a space and the day's communal life began. But that first hour was theirs, and perhaps, in the long years of their work in the library, those accumulated first hours, that accumulated solitude in the morning, that accumulated undisturbed quiet, were among the things they valued most about the life they had chosen? We cannot know. They did not write about it. They wrote about the texts they were studying and the arguments they were making and the variants they had identified in the manuscripts they were comparing. But they arrived early, and in arriving early they claimed the quiet. Let us also think about the scholar who stayed late. Not the same scholar necessarily, though it might be. Some people are both early arrivers and late departers, possessing a particular appetite for the uninterrupted working hours. But often it was a different scholar, one whose best thinking happened in the later hours, when the energy of the day had settled into something calmer, and the mind, tired from its daytime work, moved more slowly and perhaps more clearly through the problems it was considering. The late scholar worked as the light failed. They moved their work toward the lamp when natural light was no longer sufficient. The lamp made a small warm circle in the dimming room. Outside the circle, the library was growing darker, the scroll cases becoming indistinct shapes, the walls receding into shadow. Inside the circle of lamplight, the scholar continued. Their pen moved, or they read, leaning close to bring the text into the light, or they sat with their pen at rest, thinking, with the particular focused abstraction of someone who has a problem and is turning it over in their mind without forcing an answer. The lamp burned. The oil in its reservoir diminished slowly. The wick needed trimming periodically, a small task accomplished quickly, the scholar pinching the blackened tip of the wick to keep the flame clear and the light consistent. Other scholars had left. The library had emptied while this one stayed on. The sounds of the departing scholars had faded. The rolling up of scrolls, the gathering of materials, the quiet footsteps moving toward the door. And then silence. And then only this one scholar, in the lamplight, in the empty library. They were, in some sense, alone with the collection. All those scrolls, all those texts, all that accumulated knowledge, and only them in the lamplight, working through one small part of it with the focused attention of someone who had been doing this for years and expected to continue for years more. This is a particular kind of solitude that scholars have known in every period. It is not a lonely solitude. It is a chosen and appreciated solitude, the solitude of someone whose primary company is texts, who is in a sense never alone in a library, because the library contains the thoughts of many minds across many centuries, and engaging with these thoughts is a form of company. The scholar at the lamplight is alone and surrounded, quiet and engaged. At the end of a long day, and not particularly tired, or tired in the pleasant way of someone who has used themselves well and is nearly at the natural end of what they intended to do today. Eventually the lamp begins to burn low. The scholar notices. They read one more passage, or write one more note, or make a final comparison between two versions of a text. Then they close the scroll, or set down the tablet, or cap the ink. They blow out the lamp. In the sudden dark they sit for a moment while their eyes adjust. Then they get up. They gather what they need to take with them. They make their way through the dark library, knowing it well enough to navigate without light, the positions of the tables and the scroll cases familiar enough to be navigated by memory. Toward the door. They leave. The library is dark and empty, and it will remain so until morning, when someone will arrive, perhaps the early scholar, perhaps the building attendant, and open it up again, and the day's work will begin. The scrolls wait in the dark, patient as only objects can be patient, without awareness of waiting, without impatience, simply there, in their cases, in the dark, containing what they have always contained, ready to be read when someone comes to read them. In the dark, the library is very quiet, more quiet than during the day, more quiet than the occupied quiet of scholars at work, more quiet even than the early morning quiet of the single scholar in the empty room. This is the complete quiet of absence. No breath, no movement, no awareness. And it is this quiet that settles over everything. The quiet of the library at night, the quiet of all those ancient libraries in all their nights that we are settling into now. The Museion at Alexandria in the dark, the tablet library at Nineveh in the dark, the scriptoria of medieval monasteries in the dark, the smaller libraries of ancient temples and palaces, their lamps out, their collections at rest, all of them quiet, all of them still, and in their stillness preserving what they preserve, waiting for morning and the scholar who will come and take up the work again. And in your stillness you are part of that quiet, part of the long history of minds at rest after a day of careful work, part of the library of the night, where everything is preserved, where everything waits, where the morning will come and the work will continue, but not yet. For now, the dark and the quiet and the rest. Good night. A closing inventory of the ancient library. Before we finish entirely, let us make a slow inventory of what is in the library, not to count everything. The count would be too large, and counting is not what we are doing. But to name some things quietly, the way you might run your hand along the shelves of a familiar room in the dark, touching the things you know without needing to see them. There are scrolls of Homer, many copies, in various conditions, some old and worn from much handling, some newer, more crisp. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the foundational texts of Greek literary culture, read and reread and quoted and memorized and argued over for centuries. The scholars have worked through them many times. The textual problems are well documented, the difficult passages are marked with their critical signs. There are the philosophical works, Plato in multiple dialogues of the Republic, the Symposium, the Timaeus, the others, Aristotle in the works that survived his school, the ethics, the politics, the works on animals and plants and the natural world, the poetics, the works on logic and rhetoric, the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Skeptics, the schools of philosophy that arose after Aristotle and offered different answers to the same large questions. There are the historical works, Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon and the others who wrote about the history of the Greek world, the accounts of Alexander's campaigns, the histories of Egypt and Persia and other regions, written in Greek and in other languages. There are the medical works, Hippocrates and Galen and the other medical writers, the accumulated knowledge of ancient medicine, its accurate observations, its less accurate theories, its practical guidance, its case studies, its debates. There are the mathematical works, Euclid and Archimedes and the others who worked out the geometry and arithmetic and astronomical mathematics of the ancient world, the proofs and the demonstrations and the calculations. There are the poetic works, the lyric poets, the tragic dramatists, the comic dramatists, the historians of literature who described poets and plays now lost, the hymns and the songs and the epigrams. There are works of geography, describing the shape of the known world as ancient geographers understood it, the coastlines, the mountains, the rivers, the distances between places, the peoples who lived in different regions. There are the astronomical texts, recording the movements of the planets and the stars, the calculations of eclipses, the calendrical systems, the observations accumulated over centuries. There are the texts in languages other than Greek, Egyptian and Aramaic and Hebrew and others, representing the knowledge of other civilizations that the collecting activities of the library had brought into the collection. And there are works that are now lost, works that were in the library at Alexandria and that did not survive to the present day, works that we know existed only because other ancient writers mentioned them, works whose titles we sometimes know but whose contents are gone. The plays of playwrights who wrote hundreds of plays and whose complete work survives only in a few examples. The philosophical works of thinkers whose ideas we know only second hand. These lost works are also part of the library in a sense. They are the empty spaces, the gaps in the shelves, the labels with nothing behind them. And we are not going to think too hard about them right now, because thinking about what is lost is not the direction we want to go. Instead, we are going to think about what is there, the scrolls in their cases, the tablets on their shelves, the manuscripts in their bindings, the knowledge in its various containers, preserved and organized and available to whoever comes to look. It is all there, or most of it, or enough of it to sustain thousands of years of scholarship, and still there is more to find, more to understand, more to argue about, more to discover in a text that has been read 10,000 times, and still yields something to the careful reader who comes with a new question. The library is full, and the library is quiet, and you are in it, and everything you need for tonight is already here. The scrolls, the tablets, the manuscripts, the quiet, and the long, slow, patient stillness of everything that has been preserved and is waiting. Waiting for morning. Waiting for the scholar who will come and take up the work. But that is morning. This is now, and now is for rest. The lamp is out. The library is dark. Everything is in its place. Sleep well. Good night. The smell of ink in the morning. There is one detail not yet mentioned, and it is the smell of ink in the morning. When a scholar uncapped their inkpot at the beginning of the day's work, there was a particular smell, sharp, slightly acidic, with a dark undertone that was hard to name precisely, but was entirely recognizable to anyone who had been around inkpots for years. The smell of carbon ink, or iron gall ink, or the reed sap inks of various ancient cultures. Each had its specific character, but all of them had in common the particular quality of something concentrated and purposeful, the smell of a substance designed to make a permanent mark. This smell was the smell of the beginning of work. The scholar uncapped the ink and the smell reached them, and something in the body and the mind shifted slightly toward the mode of working. It was a small shift, barely perceptible. But it was real, in the way that the smell of coffee is real for people who begin their days with coffee, a signal to the nervous system that something is about to start, and then the pen was dipped, and the work began. The dipping of the pen in ink was its own small ritual. Too much ink and the pen would blot on the first stroke, spreading beyond the intended line and leaving a dark, shapeless mark instead of a clean one. Too little ink, and the pen would drag. producing a broken or faint line that faded before the stroke was completed. The right amount of ink produced a clean, flowing stroke, the letter forming exactly as intended, the ink transferring smoothly from the pen to the surface. Learning the right amount of ink to take on the pen was part of learning to write, and it was learned early in the training of any scribe. By the time a scholar was doing independent scholarly work, the dipping of the pen was entirely automatic, the right depth, the right amount of ink, the right moment to begin writing, all calibrated without conscious decision. The pen was dipped, and the writing began. Line after line, hour after hour, day after day. The smell of ink in the morning, and the scratch of the pen on the surface, and the quiet of the room, and the gradual accumulation of text on the fresh page or scroll. These were the daily elements of the scholar's life, as familiar and as unremarkable as the elements of any practiced daily work. And they are peaceful to imagine now, at this distance of years and centuries, the morning, and the ink, and the quiet, and the pen, and the text appearing line by line on the clean surface, letter by letter, word by word, the slow, patient making of something that would outlast the person making it. The text on the scroll outlasted the scholar. The scroll in the library outlasted the city. Some of the texts outlasted the libraries that held them, carried into other collections, other languages, other centuries, and some did not outlast. They stopped somewhere in the chain of transmission, a fire, a flood, a war, a simple failure to copy in time, and were gone. But the ones that survived did so because someone in a library in the morning dipped their pen and began to copy, and the morning was quiet, and the ink smelled sharp and dark and purposeful, and the pen made its careful marks, and the text moved from one scroll to another, from one hand to another, across the centuries, until it arrived wherever it is now, which is somewhere in the world, still available to be read, still there, still preserved. Because of that morning, and that pen, and that quiet scholar in that quiet library, doing their unremarkable, necessary, completely ordinary work. It is a good thought to sleep on. The quiet work that preserves things, the patient hands that copy and organize and care for, the mornings and the ink and the scratching of the pen, all of it continuing somewhere right now, all of it ensuring that what is worth keeping is kept. Rest in that assurance. The library is taking care of things. It has always taken care of things. Sleep now. Good night. The catalogue entry, one last time. This is the last entry. Title, The Quiet Life of Scholars in Ancient Libraries. Subject, Scholarship. Libraries, Ancient, Daily Life, Silence. Location, everywhere that people sat with texts and cared about them. Date, from the earliest writing until now and continuing. Condition, well preserved in the main. Some losses, the essential qualities intact. Notes, the quiet has not diminished with the passing of years. The work continues. The libraries are still full. The scholars are still arriving in the morning and staying late and dipping their pens and making their careful marks and going home when the light fails. The ink still smells the same. The quiet is still the same quiet. And you are in it now. Cross-reference. See also, morning, stillness, the sound of nothing in particular happening, the weight of a clay tablet, the scratch of a reed pen on papyrus, the smell of lamp-black ink, the ruffle of a scroll being unrolled, the light in a stone room at different hours of the day. See also, sleep, End of entry. End of the catalogue. The library is closed. The lamps are out. The scholars are home. The scrolls are in their cases. The tablets are on their shelves. The ink is capped. The pens are at rest. And so are you. Good night. The long afternoon. In the library. There is a particular quality to a long afternoon in a library that is worth describing, because it is different from the morning and different from the evening, and it has its own specific texture that is recognizable to anyone who has spent long afternoons in libraries. In the afternoon, the initial energy of the morning has been used. The mind has been working for several hours. The specific alertness of fresh work has softened into something more settled, more habitual, a mode of working that is less sharp but also less effortful. The scholar moving through their work the way a long-distance walker moves through the middle miles, efficiently and without the self-consciousness of the beginning or the relief of the end. The light in the afternoon library is good. It has passed its midday harshness and become warm again, the golden quality returning, the shadows lengthening back toward the positions they held in the early morning but from the other direction. A scholar whose table is positioned correctly can have beautiful light in the afternoon, warm, directional, making the text on the scroll or tablet crisp and readable. The sounds of the afternoon library are continuous and familiar. The scratching of pens, the occasional soft movement of someone shifting in their seat, the distant sound of the city outside muffled by the library walls. These sounds have been part of the background for hours and have ceased to be individually noticed. They are simply the texture of the afternoon. In this mode, settled, accustomed, neither beginning nor ending, a scholar can work for a long time without particularly noticing the time passing. The work absorbs attention without effort. The hours accumulate. The text progresses. The pile of completed work grows imperceptibly but steadily on one side of the table, while the pile of work remaining decreases on the other. This is in many ways the best state of work. Not the excited energy of a fresh start, which is also good, but this, the sustained, habitual, effortless continuation that comes from being well into something, from having found the rhythm of it, from the repetition having smoothed out whatever friction the beginning contained. The ancient scholar in the afternoon library was in this state, working, not thinking about working, not fighting the work, not producing the work with effort and will, simply doing it the way you breathe, because it is what you do, because the body and mind know how to do it, because the rhythm has been established and maintains itself. The afternoon passes, the light shifts, slowly. The work continues. Nothing in particular happens, everything proceeds. This is the afternoon in the ancient library, quiet, sustained, ordinary, sufficient. And now the afternoon is passing into evening, and the light is fading, and the scholar is noting this. At the edge of their attention, the part of the mind that monitors the light and time while the main part continues its work. The lamp will need to be lit soon, or the work will stop for today and continue tomorrow. Either way, the day has been used well. The text is further along than it was this morning. The knowledge is a little better organized, a little better understood, a little more available. That is enough. That is always enough. One day's work in the library, done in the ordinary way, quietly, carefully, in the light that was available, with the tools that were available, by the scholar who was there. Good night. the last thing the scholar does before leaving. The last thing the scholar does before leaving the library is roll up the scroll they have been working with. This is a careful process. The scroll must be rolled back to its beginning. You cannot leave a scroll half open, because the open portion is vulnerable, and the scroll will not store properly partially unrolled. So you hold the scroll in both hands, the right hand feeding the unread portion back onto the rod, while the left hand takes up the scroll you have already read, reversing the reading process. The scroll must be rolled evenly and at the right tension, not too tight, which can crease the papyrus, and not too loose, which allows the scroll to shift and become uneven. The experienced scholar rolls at the right tension without thinking about it, their hands knowing the feeling of a correctly rolled scroll. When the scroll is fully rolled, the rod extends slightly at both ends. The scholar takes the titulus, the small identifying label, and ensures it is hanging correctly from the end of the rod. They check that the label identifies the text correctly. They place the scroll in its case. This is the last thing. And then they stand and gather what they are taking home, any notes they made today, any tablets or personal materials, and they walk to the door, and they leave, and the scroll is in its place, and the library is a little closer to done for the day. It is not dramatic, it is just rolling a scroll, just placing it in its case, just leaving. And the library holds what it holds and waits for tomorrow, and the scholar walks home through the streets of the ancient city, thinking perhaps about what they read today, or perhaps about dinner, or perhaps about nothing at all. And the evening comes, and the library is quiet, and the scroll is in its place, and everything is where it should be, and so are you, in your place, at the end of the day, with everything where it should be. Good night. An accounting of the day, the scholar, walking home, might make a small mental accounting of the day. Not a formal review, not a list, just the natural retrospective that the mind does as it transitions from the focused state of work to the more relaxed state of the journey home. Today, a section of the text compared with 2 other copies, 3 variants identified, 1 variant resolved. The better reading clearly 1 version, the evidence sufficient for confidence. 2 variants not yet resolved, requiring further comparison tomorrow, or perhaps requiring a text in another section of the library that will need to be retrieved. A note written about a difficult passage, the argument recorded, the evidence cited, the conclusion stated tentatively because the evidence was not quite conclusive, a short conversation with another scholar about a related problem, not long, 5 minutes, but useful, a new angle on something that had been stuck, a new scroll retrieved from the collection, read through quickly to assess its relevance, mostly relevant. We'll need more careful attention tomorrow. This is the accounting. Small, specific. The ordinary progress of ordinary scholarly work. Most of it will not be remembered tomorrow. The specifics will blur into the general forward progress of the work. But the work is a little further along, the problem is a little better understood. Tomorrow's work will start from a slightly more advanced position than today's began, and over weeks and months and years this daily accumulation of small progress produces something. The finished edition, the completed commentary, the scholarly work that other scholars will read and use and argue with and build on. All of it from these small daily accountings, all of it from these ordinary afternoons in the library, all of it from the scratch of the pen and the rolling of the scroll and the dipping of the stylus in the ink. Ordinary, quiet, sufficient. This is how knowledge is made. This is how it has always been made. This is how it will continue to be made in whatever form the future provides. But that is the future. This is now, and now is finished for today. The accounting is done. The scroll is in its place. The lamp is out. The library is quiet. And you are quiet too. And the night is here. And sleep is here. And everything that needed to happen today has happened. Rest. The library will be open tomorrow. The scrolls will be in their places. The scholars will come. But that is tomorrow. Tonight is for rest. Deep, quiet, unhurried rest. In the library of the night, where everything is preserved, where everything waits, where the morning will come when it comes. And until then, silence. And the scrolls in their cases, and the tablets on their shelves, and the ink drying on the last page written today, and you, here, quiet, at rest. Good night. The scholar's hands. The scholar's hands, after years of this work, have a particular character. They are ink-stained usually. Not dramatically, they wash their hands regularly. But there is a residual darkness around the cuticles and in the small creases of the finger joints that does not entirely wash away. Carbon-based ink stain deeply. Iron gall inks, which bite into the surface of the writing material, also bite slightly into the skin. After years, the ink is almost a feature of the hands. The index and middle fingers of the writing hand have a callus, a small smooth thickening of the skin at the point where the pen rests. This is the reed callus or the stylus callus, depending on the tool. It is not painful. It is simply the permanent record of many thousands of hours of holding a writing instrument, the skin adapting to the recurring pressure in the way skin does. The wrist of the writing hand is flexible. Years of small, precise movements have given it a range and precision of motion that the non-writing wrist does not have. The scholar can rotate the pen with their wrist in ways that feel effortless, because they have done it 10,000 times and the joint has learned. The hands are not especially strong. The work of the scholar is not heavy physical work, and the hands reflect this. They are the hands of someone who does fine, precise work rather than heavy work. They handle papyrus and parchment and clay with an automatic delicacy, a habitual gentleness that comes from knowing how fragile text can be. These hands unroll the scroll. These hands dip the pen. These hands form the letters that the mind is producing. These hands turn the pages and adjust the tablet and trim the lamp wick. These hands, working day after day in the library, are the direct physical connection between the mind of the scholar and the surface of the text. They are ordinary hands, grown particular through long practice, and they are at rest now. The pen is down, the scroll is closed, the inkpot is capped, the hands are still, as your hands are still, as everything is still, in the quiet of the library at the end of the day, in the quiet of the room at the end of the evening, in the quiet that has no edges, that extends in all directions, that is not the absence of something, but the presence of rest. The scholars of ancient libraries work their whole lives in this quiet. They found it sufficient. They found it in many ways the best environment a mind could inhabit, surrounded by the products of other minds, engaged with ideas that had been worked over for centuries, adding their own small contribution to the long accumulation of human understanding. It was enough. It is enough. You are in it now. The quiet is here. The rest is here. Everything is where it should be. The library keeps its knowledge, and you keep your quiet, and the night continues at its own unhurried pace, and sleep will come, or is already here, settling at the edges of awareness like a slow tide. Let it come. There is nothing to do but let it come. The work is done for today. The scrolls are rolled, the lamps are out, the library is dark and quiet and still and holding everything it holds. Good night. One more scroll. There is one more scroll on the table. The scholar left it there, intending to return to it, and now the library is empty and quiet, and the scroll is simply sitting there, half unrolled, the text visible in the dim remaining light. The text is from a work of natural history. It describes, in careful measured prose, the habits of migratory birds, how they know when to leave, how they find their way, what they eat along the route, where they go, and why. The observations are meticulous. The scholar who wrote this text watched birds carefully over many years and recorded what they saw. The scroll lies there with this text visible, unread tonight, waiting for tomorrow. The birds in the text are still migrating in the imagination of anyone who reads the text. They are still crossing the sea in the description, still following their ancient routes, still returning in spring to the places they left in autumn. The text holds them. The scroll holds the text. The library holds the scroll. And the birds fly in the text as they fly in the world, in the quiet of the library night, in the ongoing present tense of written things. This is what texts do. They keep things in the present that would otherwise be past. The birds the ancient naturalist watched are long gone. The specific birds, the specific days. But the watching is preserved in the scroll, and the scroll is in the library, and the library holds it, and anyone who reads it enters the present tense of the observation. This is why the library matters. This is why the quiet work of the scholars matters, because what they preserved is not past. It is available. It is here, as you are here, and as the quiet is here, and as sleep is here, waiting at the edge of this moment, patient as a library scroll in its case, ready to be opened when you are ready to open it. You are ready. The library is quiet. The scroll can wait until morning. The birds in the text will still be flying when you wake. Sleep now. The text will keep. It always keeps. That is what texts do. And what you do tonight is rest. Quietly. In the library of the night, where everything is held, where everything waits, where the morning will come. Good night. The library holds its breath in the dark. The scrolls are patient. The tablets are still. The ink is dry on today's last page, and you are here, and the quiet is here, and there is nothing left to do tonight but let the quiet do what quiet does. Good night.